He may be the most prolific serial killer in American history, or one of them, but most people don't even know his name. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Carl Eugene Watts. Viewer discretion is advised. Before we get started, if you are new here, hello, I'm Mike. I tell true crime stories here on YouTube. I tell at least 3 stories a week. So if you're into that sort of thing, please give this page a subscription. That was a weird way to say it. I got hundreds of videos for you to peruse through. Peruse through? Is that even the right word? I don't know. But at any rate, let's get into today's story. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7th, 1953 in Killeen, Texas. Yeehaw. His dad was in the Army, and his mom was a kindergarten teacher. The family did kind of bounce around from different states as Carl grew up. His sister was born, and then after that, that's basically when their parents separated. And that's when Carl's mom took both the kids and they moved to Michigan. As a young child, Carl got like meningitis and polio, and it caused a lot of issues with his memory and his ability to learn. And so schooling was pretty problematic for him. And he at school was kind of like just sort of like a shy kid, kind of tucked himself into a corner and didn't socialize a lot. When he was 15, Carl was basically working as a paper boy. And this is kind of a bizarre story, but in June of 1969, and this is in Detroit now, when he's delivering papers, one of his, I guess, clients or customers opens the door, and Carl, for whatever bizarre reason, just punches the customer directly in the face. The person falls down, and then Carl begins to punch them more. And then he just leaves and continues to do his job. It's the weirdest thing. He would be arrested a few days later, and they asked him, like, why did you do this? And he just said, I just felt like beating someone up. Okay. So because of this, he was ordered to see a psychiatrist, and they kind of discovered that Carl, who by this time was actually going by the nickname Coral, well, he had some troubling thoughts. Basically, he had fantasies about killing women. He never apologized for the attack he did on that customer of his, and he didn't really seem to mind. He didn't really seem to care that he did it. At the same time, he's also given tests, and they figured out he has an IQ of about 70 to 75. And then over the next couple of years, he's basically going in and out of psychiatric treatment. His grades are just constantly getting worse. But he would eventually graduate from Northeastern High School in 1973. And eventually, he would end up enrolling at Western Michigan University. But he wasn't doing so good there either. He had issues with attending class, his grades weren't doing good, and he had some issues again with the law, harassing people and borderline assaulting people. And then on October 30th, 1974, a 19-year-old student at the same college, Gloria Steele, she was found murdered. She had been stabbed over 30 times. And whoever did this to her left the murder weapon stabbed and embedded into her spine. She was not sexually assaulted. There was nothing stolen from her person or her apartment. And no one really knew what the motive was for this. Witnesses said they saw a younger black male approaching her apartment, but they didn't know who it was. On November 12, 1974, 2 women were attacked by a younger black male that he attempted to either strangle them or stab them, but they managed to get away from him. And eventually, police gave these 2 women a lineup of men, and in that lineup, Carl Eugene Watts was in it, and they both picked him independently. They weren't like with each other when they picked him out. They both chose him as the man who attacked them. So he was arrested. They had suspected, based on the description of the person who was last seen going to Gloria Steele's apartment, they suspected that Carl may have been involved, but he denied it. They couldn't find any physical evidence to connect him to the murder, so they couldn't do anything about it. But he was sentenced to a year in prison for the attempted assaults on those two women. He served about 8 months. Sometime after that, Carl would meet a young woman. They would get pregnant, and he had a child with her. But then he ended up marrying a different woman, and that woman and him moved into this house together. But then his behavior, around her became very kind of borderline scary. He would wake up in the middle of the night saying he wanted to fist fight someone. He would dump garbage just all over their house. He just seemed very bizarre, and he seemed a little on edge like all the time with her, and he scared her. And it got to a point where, thankfully, she was able to basically just get away from him, and they ended up getting a divorce. And that is when the true nightmare would begin. September 21st, 1979. 34-year-old Malak Mimi Haddad was found murdered, and she had been beheaded. And unfortunately, to this very day, her head has actually never been recovered. On October 2nd, 1979, 20-year-old Dawn Jerome was found murdered in Detroit, and she had been strangled to death. October 3rd, 1979, Peggy Pacamera, she was found strangled and murdered, and her body was just left on someone's front lawn. October 31st, 1979, 44-year-old Janine Klein was found murdered and stabbed 13 times, and her body was located just outside her house. December 1st, 1979, Helen Mae Butcher, a 36-year-old woman, she had been found stabbed just outside, or I guess maybe in the alleyway of an H&M dry cleaning business. She had been stabbed 12 times. Now, her murder, or at least the end of it, was actually seen by someone from a distance. And the person who described her attacker said the attacker was a younger black male. They were able to come up with a composite drawing. They said the guy was wearing like some sort of beanie or some kind of cap. He had a beard. And the way Carl looked at the time was pretty spot on to this composite. But I don't think that would actually be pieced together until much later on. March 10th, 1980. 23-year-old Hazel Conniff, she was found deceased on her boyfriend's driveway in Detroit. She was actually attached to the fence with a belt wrapped around her throat. And it appeared that her cause of death was strangulation. March 31st, 1980. 26-year-old Denise Dunmore was found murdered. She had also been strangled to death, and this was in a parking lot in Detroit. April 20th, 1980. 17-year-old Shirley Small, she was found murdered. She had been stabbed to death, and this was literally just outside of the home she lived at with her parents. May 31st, 1980. 27-year-old Linda Monterio, she was found murdered. She was strangled and her body was just left just outside of her home in Detroit. July 13th, 1980. 26-year-old Glenda Richmond was found stabbed and murdered. She was stabbed 28 times. And this was just outside of the apartment she lived in. And this is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. September 14th, 1980. 20-year-old Rebecca Huff was found stabbed to death. She had been stabbed 44 times just outside her apartment. I guess at this point, police said, okay, there's a pattern here. These are all white women who are either being stabbed to death or strangled, and it tends to happen on Sunday mornings. So the newspapers were calling this person the Sunday morning slasher. And Carl Eugene Watts his name was given to police, and he was just kind of on their list of suspects. But I guess at the time, they just didn't really have any way of connecting him to all of these murders. Now, as these are happening, there are also other attacks that have happened where women have thankfully survived. Either this person attempted to kidnap them and stab them or strangle them, but they got away somehow, some way. And throughout all of this, a lot of witnesses would say they're seeing kind of the same car, which was a brown Grand Prix, which is actually the same kind of vehicle that Carl Eugene Watts was known to drive. Now, at this point, they were able to obtain a warrant. They were able to search Carl's home or wherever he was living at the time. They also searched his car, but they didn't find any physical evidence that would actually suggest he was the one to be committing all of these murders. It also needs to be noted that so far, none of these women were sexually assaulted at all, and none of them were robbed. So this was literally just someone going around stabbing people or strangling people. And so, again, they were just left with no evidence. They had no fingerprints, no DNA. They had some scarce eyewitnesses who saw the attacker from a distance. They had the same vehicle, but you still need physical evidence. And unfortunately, they had no choice but to let him go because you need it. You need evidence to arrest and convict someone. And so at that point, he was let go, and then he moved to Texas without telling anyone. But the police in Michigan were positive that he was their guy. And they also just didn't know he moved to Texas. So they're still searching for him in Michigan, or they're trying to keep tabs on him in Michigan, but not realizing he had already left. But eventually, the police in Michigan were able to contact Carl's last known employer in Michigan, and they told the police that he had given them a forwarding address, which was in Texas, to mail his last paycheck. And so they were able to go to Texas. They were able to find out where Carl was working now. They told his new employer, please keep an eye on this man because he's a suspect in a bunch of murders and abductions and other assaults. Which I guess probably kind of freaked out the new employer, what? It's alarming to kind of hear that sort of thing. But, again, police didn't have what they needed. And what made matters worse is that Carl, when he found out police from Michigan were in Texas, he was moving from apartment to apartment, bouncing around Houston and Dallas and just various places in that area of Texas to just completely confuse police as to where the hell he was. On September 5th, 1981, Carl would begin another horrific spree. That's when he came across 22-year-old Linda Tilley. He saw her in her car, and she just followed her wherever she went in his car and just kind of stalked her for a bit. And he finally, after many, many miles, followed her to where I guess her apartment was. Got out of his car, he stalked her walking, and then he grabbed her from behind. She tried to fight back, and they ended up getting into the apartment complex's pool area where he took her and he put her head underwater and drowned her until she was dead. Apparently, her toxicology report would come back that she was intoxicated, I guess. And so at first they said, she just was drunk and she fell in the pool, and they didn't really think anything of it at the time. September 12th, 1981. 25-year-old Elizabeth Ann Montgomery was out walking her dog around her apartment complex when she was accosted by someone and she was stabbed. She was stabbed just once, and it went directly into her heart, and it killed her. September 13th, 1981. 21-year-old Susan Wolf was followed by Carl after he saw her at a store, and he followed her back to her apartment. And just as she's about to get into her apartment with her keys in the door, Carl comes up behind her and just stabs her 9 times and killed her. And then he left. January 4th, 1982. 27-year-old Ellen Tam was out for a jog that particular morning. And later that morning, her body was found hanging from a tree, just out in the open. in the middle of the day. Initially, the coroner said she did it to herself, that it was a suicide, which was ridiculous, but that's what they ruled it as at the time. January 16th, 1982. 25-year-old Margaret Fossey had just pulled into the driveway of her house. Carl had followed her like he had been, that's like his new thing. And she rolled down the window because she noticed he was following her, and she was in the driveway, and he just walks up to her in the car and he punches her directly in the throat. And he then takes her and then puts her in her own trunk, and he takes off in her car. He then attacks another woman on the highway, but she manages to get away. And then on January 29th, he attacks another woman, and he stabs her 3 times, but she manages to survive. But these two attacks, unfortunately, he attacked them from behind, and they can only really say that it was a black male, but they didn't really get a good look at his face. January 30th, 1982, he attacks another woman who also survives. This time she's able to give a slightly better description, saying again that it was a black male, somewhere around 5'11", maybe 6 foot, about 160 pounds, which would fit the description of Carl Eugene Watts. February 7th, 1982. 20-year-old Elena Simander, she was found deceased in a dumpster. She lived at the apartment complex where the dumpster was, and so they believe she must have been accosted just before she got into her apartment at some point that day. March 20th, 1982. 14-year-old Emily Lacroix was found murdered. Her body was dumped inside of a drainage ditch. March 27th, 1982. 34-year-old Edith Ledette. She was out for a jog when she was stabbed 17 times. April 15th, 1982. Yolanda Garcia. She was 21 years old, and she had been found stabbed to death. She was stabbed 4 times. April 17th, 1982, Carrie Jefferson. She had been attacked and abducted from her driveway at her house. She was found later in this big ditch area, partially buried. April 21st, 1982, 25-year-old Suzanne Surlis was abducted, and she was later found strangled to death. And also she was drowned as well because someone had put her head in a flower pot full of water. May 23rd, 1982. 20-year-old Michelle Mayday was actually having a birthday celebration. She was having fun. Well, he followed her home after her party. He, I guess, got into her apartment where he would end up strangling her and drowning her in her bathtub. And that's where she was found deceased. And then finally, in May of 1982, the nightmare would end. Carl Watts had managed to get himself in the apartment of 2 women, Melinda Aguilar and Lori Lister, and this was at the Hammerly Apartments. Well, one of the women, and they were being attacked by Carl, and one of the women was able to get away and get to a neighbor where they called 911. When police arrived, Carl was still there, and he saw them and he fled the police. As he was fleeing, they noticed a brown Grand Prix there, and that's the car he tried to run to. But there was an officer next to the car, so Carl saw that. He took off a different direction, and he ended up running himself down an alleyway with no way out. And the police got there, and they all pointed guns at him. He put his hands up, and they arrested him. Carl basically would end up brokering a deal with the prosecution that when it came to the case where he was just apprehended, where he broke in and attempted to murder these 2 women, apparently he would agree to take lesser charges if he confessed to the murders in the nearby area in Texas. And so he did. He ended up confessing to several of the murders, not only in Texas, but he would confess to murders in Michigan. And this deal would only get him 60 years in prison. Despite confessing to a bunch of murders, they only were able to really convict him of a handful of them or a few of them in Texas. Michigan, by the way, was yeah, no, Texas, you do your thing, but we're still going after him for the murders here. So he attempted to drown one of the women at the apartments where he was caught, the women that survived. And apparently, this is strange, he wasn't informed that the bath and the bath water was basically considered a deadly weapon. Because he wasn't informed of that, there was this technicality, from what I understand. Maybe someone who understands this case better than me can clarify, but because he wasn't informed of this, he was then eligible to get parole. And basically they did the math, and that if Carl served his time with no incidences, he didn't get in any kind of trouble in jail, he could be released as early as 2006. And it took until 2004 for them to finally be able to lay charges on him for at least one of the murders in Michigan. That would be Helen Dutcher's case. That's the case where there was a physical witness who saw the man at the end of the attack that matched the description of Carl, the one that they had the composite drawing that was very similar to how Carl looked at the time. But the Michigan courts were going to allow the fact that Carl admitted to multiple murders in Texas and Michigan back in Texas. So they allowed that to be entered into the trial. And this is the trial for the murder of Helen Dutcher. And so he goes on trial for that. The witness was still alive, the one who saw the end of the attack, and he testified. And so Carl Watts was then sentenced to life in prison without parole. So whatever he would have served in Texas wouldn't have mattered, because he now has life in prison without parole in Michigan. Then they gather more evidence and more witnesses to put him on trial again for the murder of Gloria Steele in Michigan. So in 2007, he goes on trial for her murder, and once again, he is found guilty, and he is sentenced to another life term without the possibility of parole. Carl Eugene Watts was never going to see the light of day again, thanks to Michigan. And the man died in prison in 2007. He actually had prostate cancer. Carl Eugene Watts, he either confessed to, or they had enough evidence to suggest that he definitely murdered a total of 14 women, for sure. They pretty much knew that for a fact. But there were somewheres around 100 to 150 different women that met the same MO, the same type of abduction, the fact that these women weren't sexually assaulted, they weren't robbed. There are also some women who went missing in the same exact area that have never been found, that would have fit the description of someone that Carl would have killed. So he is actually suspected. And at one point, he even said that I've killed up to like 100 or 200 women or something like that. So they really believe, like genuinely believe, that he may have killed somewheres between 100 to 200 women, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, next to someone like Samuel Little. But oddly enough, he's just kind of one of those names that most people have never really heard of. I hadn't heard of him before. I never heard of his name until I recommended this case by someone, and I was reading about him, and it's kind of crazy that you think about it. But this guy killed that many people. I mean, for sure we know he killed 14, probably more, for sure. But Jesus, close to 200 or so. You figured he would be more of a household name like a Dahmer or a Bundy or a Gacy, but he's not. Had only the authorities in Michigan just had the evidence to get the guy for the murders in Michigan, so many women in Texas would still be alive. But it's not necessarily at the fault of the detectives, because again, you do need evidence and or confessions to go forward with a trial, and they just didn't have that. You know, you do have to follow the legal aspects in order to arrest and convict a person, and they just didn't have it. You know, at the very least, at least all of his victims and their families, and they have the peace of mind that he was finally captured, he was convicted, he was never going to see the light of day again. and he died in prison. And so hopefully they can be at some level of peace and acceptance. But that is it for this case, True Crime Maroonies. I hope you found it interesting. But like I said at the beginning, if you've just found me for the first time, I would really appreciate if you would subscribe and like this video. As of me filming this video, I had 3 million followers on TikTok, but I woke up this morning and my page was permanently banned by TikTok without warning, without reason, without anything. I don't know if I'm going to get it back. Maybe when you're seeing this video in the future, I got it back. I don't know. But as of right now, it's gone. So I do have a backup TikTok page that I'm trying to build up. It's in the link tree in this description of this video below if you want to follow it. But also please subscribe here and we'll just kind of figure it out as it goes along. But yeah, so we will see you for the next video here on YouTube. That will be in a couple of days. And until then, see you later. I don't know what. See you later, True Crime, Maroony Doody Dingleberry Dongs. Yeah. No. Yeah. No. Yeah.